Okay, so we've created a pretty cool and a pretty configurable web part thus far, but there is quite a bit of room for improvement. So let's take a step back from the JavaScript programming for a moment, and let's talk a little bit about styling and about user experience inside of your SharePoint framework applications. And first of all, one of the things that we've touched on just a bit before, but we really haven't messed with too much, is our Sas file that we have set up by default whenever you first create a React or any type of SharePoint framework web part. And you get this dash.module.scss file. And we touched on that a little bit whenever we created our meter web part. But if you recall, we actually didn't do any kind of special selectors in there. All the CSS styles we use were actually element selectors. So we selected things like H1 and text elements and things like that. We didn't actually use class selectors. And the reason is because you can't necessarily just make up your own classes like you would do in HTML and then drop that same class selector into your Sas file. And just as an example, in our dash.tsx component, you'll notice it's setting on the outer div here a class name of styles.dash. And it's actually importing the styles from that Sas file as an import at the top of the file here. And if you've never worked with React, this might seem like a weird way to style your components, but what it's actually doing behind the scenes is it's going to this Sas file, it's loading in all of the various selectors that you have defined in your Sas file, and then you can reference them in your JSX just using styles.dash or styles.button or .column or any CSS declarations that you have in that file you can reference using styles dot, which is kind of neat. And not only that, but Microsoft has set up the build process in a way that kind of makes it so that if you set up your CSS declarations like this in your Sas files, you don't have to worry about your solution interfering with or conflicting with other web parts or other frameworks or other applications that might be installed in your SharePoint environment. And what I mean by that is that if we were to look into our HTML, you would expect to see div class equals, and then because this is a .dash CSS declaration over here, you would expect to see div class name equals dash in the output HTML. But if you actually look at this, if we go ahead and go down here to our dash component itself and we open it up, you'll see in the React DevTools, div class name is actually equal to dash underscore, and then there's this unique hash, this random string of text that is being appended on the end of that class. And they're going to do that every time that you build or deploy your web part. That's just kind of all handled automatically for you. But what they're doing is they're adding this unique hash. So even if you use a CSS declaration that is used elsewhere in another application, it's not going to conflict. Your styles are never going to conflict with the Office 365 styles or anything else that might be present in the SharePoint framework page where your application's loaded. And that's a good thing. It might seem like a little bit of extra work because you have to import them every time you want to use them. You can't just say class name equals dash. I mean, you can do that. So if I were to actually refresh this in the local workbench, you'll see here we have now hard-coded that class name. So you can see now we have div class name equals dash because it's just a string and it's not adding that hash to it. But then you might think you can come into your Sas file here, and let's just delete all this boilerplate, but you might just say background color is going to be red. You know, I'm going to add something really ugly to that dash, and you would expect to see this div actually have a red background color, but it has no effect because, again, behind the scenes, everything in your Sas file, when it's actually built, is actually going to be dash underscore some random text. And so in order to properly use your Sas styles in conjunction with your JSX output, you're going to need to use this format where you're importing a Sas module into your components, into your React components, and then you reference them using this expression syntax of styles dot, and then it's automatically, whoops, we need styles dot, and it's automatically going to pull in whatever styles you've defined inside of that file. So for example, if I wanted to say dot red background red, if we did it like that, I could say in here styles dot red background, and now that we've set that up and we save and refresh, I think it's going to do one more refresh here. There we go. So we see our very ugly red background when in fact the HTML output of that class is red background underscore and then this wild random text string that gets added on the end. And there are a couple of things to be aware of whenever you're using these Sass modules. First of all, you may think in a lot of cases you can come in here and say red dash background, and you can do that, but it just gets a little weird because now the syntax, you can't say dot red background inside of this expression here. That's just not allowed in JSX or in JavaScript. So you would have to say styles of red background, which will work, but I believe you actually even get a warning whenever you do this in the build. Yeah, so you'll see up there, it says the local CSS class red background is not camel case and will not be type safe. So they kind of discourage you from doing that, even though this will work, as you can see here. They prefer if you camel case all of your CSS class names. So that's just something to be aware of. It's not normally something you'd have to do, but it also make it easier to reference because then you don't have to do this weird square bracket index syntax. So generally you're going to do it in this format, and then you can just use the dot syntax, which makes it really easy to get to. And you can make as many of these modules as you like to organize your styles however you like. So for example, I could come over here and we know we have a chart component. So maybe I want to create chart.module.scss. And then all you have to do once you created this is you're going to come up to the top of your component file and you need to import styles from, and then you go to that file that you just created, chart.module.scss. Now it's going to complain unless you have at least one style to export from this Sas file. So let's just put something in. Let's create a style for the H1 tag that appears up here, the chart title. So we'll say .chart title will be text align center, font weight 200, and font size 2.5 ems. And we'll give that a save. And now that we have at least one style in there, it's actually going to load those into the styles object that we have in our import at the top. And now we can go down into our render template and we can say h1 class name equals styles dot, and you'll see that pop up as chart title. And now that we've added that, you'll see our local workbench refreshes and that style is indeed applied. Let's get rid of that horrible red background that's driving me a little crazy. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the styles out of this dash component because it doesn't actually do anything. The only thing it's doing is loading in the chart itself. So we actually don't have a need for the styles in this case. So I'll go ahead and take that out. We can even delete our dash module entirely because we're not going to need that. And you can see here it's starting to look much better. Okay, so one thing I do want to do is whenever you first add this web part to the page and you haven't selected a list or any fields yet, I want to show a message that kind of indicates to the user like, hey, go select some fields before you can see the chart. So that's fairly easy to do inside of our dash component here. We can just simply say, we can put in a ternary operator here that says this.props.listID, and if that's truthy, go ahead and output a chart component like you see here. Otherwise, output some sort of paragraph that says, select a list to continue, like so. And let's put these on multiple lines so that would give some separation there. We'll give that a quick save, and you'll see here, once this refreshes, we'll delete the old web part. And let's just add a new one so it's nice and fresh. And you see it says select a list to continue. We can hit edit, and as soon as we select a list, it'll start to visualize that data for us, which is good. So whenever we first add this to the page, I could go into our module file, could create a module for Dash and style this up. Maybe we want this to look different. But there's a lot of cases where whenever you're building your web parts, many different components that you're dropping into your web part, you really just want to kind of fold into the larger style of Office 365 or SharePoint 2016 or 2019, depending on which version you're using. But you kind of just want it to blend into the rest of the application. Your users are used to using SharePoint. They're used to using all the controls. They are going to be very comfortable with the style of that. And so there's a lot of benefit to kind of reusing the same styles and the same components that are available in Office 365. And the good news is the interface that's actually used to create all of the SharePoint framework stuff and all of your Office 365 components is open source and completely free to use. And not only that, but it's based on React components, and they have some really great React components that you can simply import into your solution and drop them into the render function of your React component, and it just gets all the styles that you might need, which is really, really cool. So let's take a look at that now. This is called the Office UI Fabric, and you can find a link to this in the video description down below. And believe it or not, if you chose the React template whenever you are setting up your SharePoint Framework web part, you already have this installed and available. This is a really cool open source interface framework that allows you to use just about everything you're going to find inside of Office 365. And it has a lot of really compelling and great components and styles that you can pull out of it and drop right into your SharePoint Framework web parts. We'll do a really quick tour here. Let's jump into the styles, and you can see it has some animations, icons, colors, and some typography and utilities, which can be very handy if you look through those. We also have components, which include things like form components. So let's start with a really basic one. Let's jump into the colors. And this is really great if you want to add some color to any component that you're building inside of SharePoint Framework. And what these are just CSS classes that allow you to drop in some background colors and text colors onto any element just by adding a CSS class. So for example, if you want the font color of a particular element to match the theme primary color, so even if a SharePoint owner of a site has customized the theme of that site to maybe have like green text be the primary color, the primary text color for that site, if you use this CSS class, it's always going to match whatever the theme primary color is, which is pretty cool because it allows your web part to kind of follow the same theme that users have provided for a site. So just as an example, I could take this and copy it, and we can just add class name equals onto that select a list to continue paragraph that we have here. And you'll see in our local workbench when that refreshes, that's going to take on the theme color, which is blue in this case. And there's all kinds of colors you can substitute. You can see we have, just by composing this class name, you can see you can specify the font color, the background color, and the border color. And in this example, they're using theme primary, but you can also have all kinds of different shades of that. So there's theme primary, which we just used, but there's also darker versions of that, lighter versions of that. There are neutral colors you could specify, and then there's also accent colors down here. So for example, if we wanted to have kind of an error message, maybe we could use the red dark color that you see here. So all I'd have to do is come over here and replace theme primary with red dark. And if we hit save and jump back into our local workbench, you'll see that paragraph gets updated with the red color. And you can compose various classes as well. So for example, if we want to change the background color on hover, we can just add a second class to this paragraph. And maybe I want it to be theme lighter on hover. So let's change that to theme lighter. So it's going to be the background color is going to be theme lighter on hover on this paragraph. And our workbench here, you'll see as I hover over the paragraph, it'll actually add that background color automatically. So those are colors. We also have in this basic one, you have things like animations. So you can see all sorts of different animations. If you need things to kind of move around or pop in to your components, you can just add, again, these classes onto it. You have brand icons, so if you need to drop in a like an icon for a file or a product or whatever, again, you can just come in here and just copy these CSS classes. So I could just take this div here, and for whatever reason, if you wanted to add that to your solution, we could drop in an icon just like so, just by copy and paste, drop that in. It's already built into the interface, and all you have to do is drop it into your solution. And you'll see here that doesn't work. And I do need to change this. Whoops, I do need to change that to class name, because again, you can't use class equals. So maybe not copy and paste directly, but as you'll see here, just by dropping that in, you get an Excel logo. So a lot of these, as you can guess, are very specific, like these brand icons. You can see, all the SharePoint stuff you can drop in. File, these document icons are particularly handy if you need to drop those in. But then you also have various other icons. And then if you look at this other icons library down here, there's a whole library of just kind of generic icons. And these are especially useful for things like buttons and toolbars, because you just get all kinds of stuff. And you can even search through this. So if I need an arrow, you can see all the different arrows they have. And all you have to do is kind of just compose these I tags with the various classes. So if I wanted to add a volume button, for example, to my solution, we could just see that this is called volume 3. So if I just take this HTML and let's replace our Excel thing with that, we'll change this to class name. And so this is going to be MS icon volume 3. And just by pasting that in, once again, you'll see here, we're going to get a nice little volume icon that pops into there. And there's different ways you can change the sizes of that, just all kinds of stuff you can do. Cool. You have a grid system. There is a responsive grid, and again, you're just gonna kind of come in here and copy this layout. We don't have a use for this now because we just have a kind of a full width chart in our particular web part, but there's certainly cases where you may have multiple columns, and this is a responsive grid as well. So depending on screen space available, you can totally rearrange the layout of your HTML and your content inside of your web parts that you built. So definitely worth looking through all this stuff. We're not going to go through every single one, but in particular, utilities are handy too if you want to have screen reader only content, for example. So maybe you have an icon like we have in this case, but you don't want that to be visible, so it's ARIA hidden whenever a screen reader is reading the page. But maybe if you didn't have a label and you just had an icon, it's probably a good idea to add span class name equals MS screen reader only, and you could put, like volume button or something like that. And then that's going to be read by the screen reader, but it won't actually be visible on the page. Just kind of a best practice for accessibility. But you have some text align classes, just kind of all kinds of stuff to check out, and it's definitely useful to utilize these. And while we're talking about these utility classes and all of these Microsoft classes that are sort of global and you can just import into your web parts wherever you want, we should also mention a couple of other ways that you can interact with the theme colors and all this other stuff that you get inside of Office UI Fabric. First of all, whenever you first set up your Sas files, you may have actually noticed when we deleted a lot of that stuff from our dash.module.scss, you're going to get this line at the top, and I'm going to paste this in from an old file that I have here. But what it's going to do is it's going to import this Microsoft/SP Office UI Fabric Core, and it's going to import this fabric core.scss file or Sas file. And this file contains a lot of very convenient variables and mix-ins and things that you can use in your own Sas files to make this a little bit easier to work with, so you don't necessarily have to memorize a lot of class names. If you want to look at this is actually inside of the @Microsoft/SP Office UI Fabric Core package. We just need to go to our node modules on the left. We're going to go to @Microsoft, and we're going to go to that SP Office UI Fabric Core package here, and then you'll notice just like here we have dist sas sp fabric core.sas. Let's go to dist sas, and then there is that file right there, that we have actually imported. So this file itself imports a bunch of other stuff, but perhaps most importantly, it's importing some variables and mix-ins. And this is the stuff that you can use if you're going to keep this import inside of your Sass file. You can use any of the variables and any of the mix-ins that are available inside of this package. Unfortunately, there's not any great documentation that I've found for this stuff. So in order for you to know what's in here, you kind of just have to go and look through these files that are being imported. So for example, if we want to look at the font variables, let's go to the variables folder and open up font variables, and you'll see all of these variables that you can just drop in to your own solution. So for example, if I scroll down just a little bit here, and maybe I want to use a large font size for our intro text, I could use this MS Font Size Super, or SU. I can just copy that, and now that this line has been imported at the top of our Sass file, I can replace our font size here with this variable that's now been imported. And if I get that as save, and this is on the chart title, so I'll have to edit this. We'll have to select a list to be able to see that chart title. Let's load in some data, and we'll put in lemonade stand earnings. And that may not be very different from what we had before, but it is actually a little bit larger. If you inspect this here, you'll see the font size is being set to 42 pixels because that is the variable value from that file that we have imported. And previously we had set that to 2.5 M, so you can see how that value is being replaced. There's a lot of other variables and mix-ins that are available inside of this Sass package. So if we go all the way up to where that is, you also have some border widths inside of this general. You have some breakpoints, which are very nice to be able to handle some responsive design if you need that. And perhaps most importantly, you have what are called the theme overrides. These are all of those theme colors that we just saw, and you can simply drop these in to your Sass file if you need to use the theme colors anywhere. This is the same thing that you saw on the Office UI Fabric website. So you'll notice as we scroll down here, we have all of our accent colors, all of our theme colors. And just as an example, we could say, I want to use the MS Color theme primary variable as the color of our chart title. So let's go ahead and copy this variable, and we'll just simply add color using that variable to our chart title class. And as our local workbench refreshes, you'll see the title of our web part actually update to be that blue color. And one interesting thing to note about this theme overrides is you'll notice the syntax they use. It's not actually Sass. This is just kind of a special thing that you can do in the Office UI Fabric where it's setting a theme color that's going to pull from the theme, and then it's going to also set a default value. And you can also do this. If you don't want to use one of these variables, you could simply just drop this into your Sass file to be able to change the color. So again, for example, if we want to use the theme color, I could also just replace this color value here with theme primary and then give it some default over on the right. And that's going to do the exact same thing. When this refreshes, it's going to pick up the theme color from our SharePoint site settings. It's going to use that, and this will actually be replaced if a theme is set. Otherwise, it's just going to fall back to some default value that you specify. Again, if you want your web part style and design to kind of fold into the larger Office 365 design aesthetic, this is a really great tool to reach for, and you get some really good stuff as part of these packages that are already a part of your web parts when you set them up. And the choice is yours in terms of how you want to approach the design aesthetic of your SharePoint framework web parts. You can utilize this class replacement feature if you like. You can utilize the Sass variables, or we can go back to how it was before and just utilize those global CSS class names inside of our component HTML itself. One thing I will mention is there is a really great resource on the documentation for SharePoint Framework that is all about designing your web parts and your components inside of the SharePoint Framework. And there is a huge tutorial talking about all the different ways that you can handle certain design features and states within your components. And this is definitely worth reading through. It talks a lot about using the Office UI Fabric, But in addition to that, you get a lot of great guidance for how to actually design your web parts, what sort of styles and patterns you can actually use to do all sorts of stuff inside the web parts themselves. So that is worth checking out. I'll post a link to this documentation in the video description down below. Cool, so that is the style section of our Office UI fabric, but probably the thing you're going to use the most is going to be these components. They have a ton of components, as you'll see here as I just quickly browse through these, that you can simply drop into your solutions. And we've actually, believe it or not, used quite a few of these already. Inside of your property pane, whenever you drop in the controls there, you're actually, for the most part, utilizing a lot of these input components that are built into Office UI Fabric. So for example, every time we use a dropdown, you'll probably recognize this one. It's the exact same dropdown that's available in Office UI Fabric. And as you can see, there's just a whole bunch of ways to extend these components, and makes it very easy to develop with whenever you're building something custom. So let's actually use one of these, and we'll actually learn how to import these components into our React components. So what we'll do is we'll go into the progress and validation, and let's grab the message bar. This is kind of a nice basic one to get started with. And then on each of these pages for the components, you get kind of some do's and don'ts. It's definitely good to take a look at that. And then you get lots of examples and variants of how you would use these components, which is very cool. But not only that, you get this show code button, which shows you exactly how to import these into your React components. So for example, if we want to pull in one of these message bars, I could import this message bar, just like you see here. So let's copy that import there. We'll jump into our dash component, and we'll just paste that at the top. So you can see here we're importing both message bar as well as message bar type. And now that we've imported that, we can simply drop in a message bar component into our render template somewhere. So let's do that now. Let's replace our paragraph down here with a message bar. And we'll put select a list to continue. We should probably, instead of doing ... we'll do a horizontal ellipsis there. All right, so let's take a look at that inside of our local workbench, and you'll see there immediately we're getting a lot of styles that we are inheriting from the Office UI, which is pretty cool. So let's try out another component. What we'll do here is in our local workbench, we will select some data and hit refresh to actually load this up. But let's look at maybe replacing this refresh button, which is currently completely unstyled. It's not looking so great at this point. So let's replace this with an Office UI Fabric component. So let's come back into the UI Fabric, and we'll go into the basic inputs and then button. And this is one I use all the time. There's a lot of different ways you can customize it. And if you scroll down here, you can see all the different versions of that. You have compound buttons, command bar buttons, just all kinds of stuff. But I like to use, for something simple like this, just like a refresh button, we'll use an action button. I think this looks kind of nice. So let's show the code for this. And what we'll do is we'll need to import the action button and iButton props. So let's copy that and drop that into, in this case, we'll put this into our chart component. So let's import that at the top, like so. And then let's find out how they're actually using that. You can see if you scroll down here, here's the actual code for the action button. So it's just an action button component. And then you can optionally provide some icon props to customize the icon name. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll scroll down here to where we have our button, and let's replace this with action button. And this is still going to have the on-click and disabled properties just like we had before. So we can keep those as normal, but I do want to customize the icon. So let's change the icon props to an object. And then you can see here they're passing in a new icon name. So what we can do is we can go back up to our styles. Let's go to our icons and find a refresh icon. So you can see that one's just called refresh in this case. And we'll set the icon name to refresh. like so. And if we hit save there in our local workbench, you'll see that gets changed to a nice styled refresh button. And if we want to center this under the chart, let's just add perhaps a footer around this. And let's tab that over. And let's give this a class name. So in our chart module file, we'll say .chart footer, and we'll simply say text align is center. And now that we have that in our module file, and here we can say class name equals styles.chart footer. And then when we save that and our local workbench refreshes, you'll see that gets aligned to the bottom of our chart in the middle. Great. And with our chart title, let's remove the top margin because there's quite a bit of space up here. If you use your inspector, you'll notice H1s get quite a bit of margin on either side by default. So let's also tweak this margin. We'll just set that to 0010 pixels. So it'll just have a little bit of bottom margin and no top margin, so that text will line all the way up with the top of the web part itself, which looks a little better. Very good. So as of right now, our loading state, if you remember, is controlling the label of our refresh button. So if we come down here to our chart component and we were just to check loading in the DevTools down here, you'll see the button does get disabled and it says loading, but that's pretty subtle. You know, it's just a light gray thing at the bottom. The user might not even notice it. So what we can do now is we can pull in another Office UI Fabric component to help make it more obvious when we're actually loading data in this case. So what we'll do in the Office UI Fabric, let's go over to Components and then Progress and Validation, and you'll see there's this component called a spinner, which is a great opportunity to do exactly what we want to do in this case. So let's grab this large spinner with label. Let's show our code. And you can see here we're going to need to import both spinner and spinner size from the Office UI Fabric. And let's drop that into our chart component at the top. There we go. And now that that's done, let's grab this last example, which is going to be this one right here. And we will scroll down and paste that in somewhere into our solution. I think what I'll do in this case is I'll actually add a div around all of our charts. So we'll tab that over and we'll put a /div right here. And then right at the top of this, we'll put this spinner here. But we only want this spinner to show up if we're loading. So we can surround this in this.state.loading. And then that's only going to appear when we're actually loading. And then instead of saying seriously still loading, we'll say loading chart data. And let's give that a save and let's go and see what that looks like inside of our local workbench. So in order to test this, we'll just go into our chart component in the React DevTools and we'll just, again, we'll check this loading state right here. And you can see when we're loading, that's going to show up as a spinner. And when we're not loading, it's going to disappear. So what I actually want to do is I want to overlay this over our chart down below because I want to kind of gray out the chart or make it a little bit transparent, if you will, so it's really obvious that we're waiting on something to occur. And the way we can do that is, first of all, let's add a class name to this outer div here. So in our module file, we'll add, up here, we'll add chart body, and that's going to need to be position relative. Like so. And then in our chart component, we can say class name equals styles.chartBody. Like that. And let's add a CSS class to our spinner as well, because we're going to want to do some stuff there. So we'll say .chart spinner. And then that'll have a position absolute. And then the chart spinner, we'll need to add this class, class name equals styles.chartSpinner. And I haven't saved this Sas file yet, which is why we're getting this red line. But as soon as we save both files, that's going to go away. So you see just a moment here. There it goes. Cool. So now that we've done that, we can kind of position our chart spinner over top. Right now, it's not going to be in the right position. If we go into this once again and we hit loading, you'll see it's just up at the top left. But it's actually now appearing on top of the chart, and things aren't moving around when we're loading, which is ideal. You don't want to move things on the user a lot. So what we can do is in this chart spinner, we'll set position absolute, top 0, left 0, right 0, bottom 0, so it'll kind of spread over the whole size of the chart. We'll set a background color of RGBA 255, 255, 255, 0.5 maybe, 0.7. We want it to be somewhat transparent, but we want this white color to appear over top of the chart, so it kind of whites everything out and makes the loading spinner more obvious. And let's add some padding to this just to make sure the spinner itself isn't all the way at the top of that box, and probably just top and bottom padding. So we'll set 30 pixels 0. And finally, we'll set a Z index just to make sure it's on top of the chart body itself. And when that refreshes, let's give this a test. We'll go into our chart component once again, and we'll check loading, and you'll see it kind of grays out or dims out the chart that you see in the background while we're loading. And when we click refresh, you'll see how that looks when there's actual chart data there. So that's looking much better. Cool, so let's jump over into our remote workbench, and we will just test this out in kind of a real world scenario to make sure it actually works. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into our network tab, and I'll turn on throttling to slow 3G, and we will hit refresh here. You'll see the loading screen, and then it pops up, which is looking great. All right, so I think that's going to do it for our web part styling and utilizing the Office UI Fabric. I would definitely recommend taking a closer look at all the different things that you get in UI Fabric, because it is a really cool and very useful library that's going to save you a ton of time. And the pattern is going to be the same for everything that you drop in. You basically just copy the imports and copy the use of that from the Office UI Fabric website, and then you're going to drop that into your SharePoint solution and utilize that right away. The only thing that I'll mention that you might run into is that currently the Office UI Fabric is, as of the time of this recording, is a little bit newer than the version you actually get inside of SharePoint Framework. And again, they're always updating SharePoint Framework, so that could change in the near future. But as of right now, SharePoint Framework is actually using an older version of both React and Office UI Fabric, which may have a few minor differences between them. So what you see in the documentation may not always work 100% of the time, but for the most part, everything is going to be the same. And while we're talking about the styles and presentation of our web part as it relates to user experience, in our next lesson, we're going to set our site on accessibility and localization.